So our first session, as mentioned in the beginning, is about policy initiatives at the global and regional levels to finance plastic circularity. And our first speaker is Roger Joseph Guzman, and he is a consultant at the Asian Development Bank. We also call him by Rocky. So Rocky will present us with a recap of the Global Plastics Treaty and the fourth session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee and implications for financing and investments. Let's all welcome Rocky.
Sorry. Thank you, Pia, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I hope you've had your coffee. And I'm glad that a lot of people are super excited to learn more about financing today in the next 2 days. So salamat pagi. Again, please call me Rocky Guzman. I am the legal consultant for the Asian Development Bank's Circular Economy team, tasked to work on engaging at the Global Plastics Treaty. And for this session, I'm very honored to be one of the first speakers of the first session. And I'll be going through a recap of what's happening at the global level, at the Global Plastics Treaty, with a focus on financing and investment. So if I could ask to go to the next slide, please, for my presentation. Now, before we start, just a disclaimer on this. Since this is a session on financing and investment, I'll be focusing more on some of these provisions which are on the implementation side of the Plastics Treaty under discussion. I will not go much into detail into the operative side, or what we call the control measures or the core obligations that countries have to do to address plastic pollution. I will go through it quickly, but if you're interested to know more about that, I can talk to you bilaterally about it after the session. So now let's go to the Plastics Treaty, where I can give the recap of this recap. So what we're talking about now is what we call, mentioned before, an internationally legally binding instrument, or ILBI, to end plastic pollution. So that's the formal name. And this includes the marine environment, ILBI. But I would call it here, for this purposes in this session, the Global Plastics Treaty, because that's what it's known colloquially, and that's the how we commonly refer it to. So this process goes back formally 2 years ago in March 2022, when the UNEA, the UN Environment Assembly, published a resolution on mandating the mandate on ILBI, towards an ILBI on plastic pollution. And this constitutes an INC, what we call an INC, International Negotiating Committee, and 4 INC meetings, going to 5 INC meetings, towards a plastics treaty in 2025. So where are we now? As some of our colleagues have said, we are in the home stretch. We've been working on this since 2022, and last year we've had 2 sessions, one in Uruguay, the second one in Paris. This year, we've had 1 session so far in Ottawa last April, and then we'll be having the last session in November in the Republic of Korea in Busan. And after this session in 2024, it is hoped that we would have the draft completed and negotiated by that time in 2024, and up for adoption by next year, 2025, where we have a scheduled diplomatic conference where all countries, parties to the INC process, would adopt it and would go up for ratification across INC members. So that's, in a nutshell, the recap of the INC process. Let's go back a bit for a sec on the first slide. So as I've said, I'm going to give a recap on the Ottawa negotiations, where ADB sits as Intergovernmental Organization Observer. Now, ADB is very much involved here because we are looking at policy and investment. And we are looking towards the anticipation of the implementation later on to assist countries in both setting the enabling conditions and policy, as well as financing and investment to fulfill their country commitments. And we hope that after the Busan session, and once it's adopted next year, that countries would start with their planning, and we would be able to assist in those matters later on. Now let's go to the next slide, please. Now that we have had a recap of the overview and timeline of the Plastics Treaty, I would like to focus on financing and investment for this session. But before we go deep dive over there, I just want to note that there are some convergence issues already being discussed in the operative elements of the plastics treaty, and this includes issues such as downstream waste management and to an extent just transition. But there are also issues where there are a lot of divergent views, and this includes the scope of the life cycle. Would it be covering the whole scope from the upstream to downstream, or just a part of that? So those are some of the issues that we have had to grapple with in the negotiations. But now I want to focus on the financing and the investment side, where there are a number of key issues that are being negotiated on and discussed. And this goes to the part of the plastics treaty draft on implementation, what we call the means of implementation measures to facilitate compliance of member countries to the plastics treaty later on. The first one I would like to highlight on is on the establishment of a multilateral fund. And this fund, the options given or being discussed is would it be a dedicated, a standalone, and independent fund? That's an option. The second one is would it be a hybrid approach where we utilize an existing fund and work towards developing a dedicated fund later on. And another option that we are discussing in the negotiations is that we could use existing mechanisms such as the Global Environment Facility, which has experience in leveraging public financing and to avoid further fragmentation in the financing landscape. So again, what I'm saying here now are these are the menu of options that we have. There has not been material negotiations yet, and there has not been an agreement yet on what we are about to see in the draft, but these are currently being discussed. Now, after the multilateral fund, we are also discussing a new concept in this landscape, I would say, and this is what we call the plastic pollution fee. So a plastic pollution fee is a fee that would be imposed to manufacturers and plastic producers in each respective country. And the discussion here is that it could either be a standalone mechanism for each country, or it could be included in extended producer responsibility, as EPR is being identified as the key modality to implement the polluter pays principle. So there are a lot of discussions over here. I'll go through some of these issues later on, but suffice to say that for now, it's still in the draft text and is being deliberated on by member countries. The next one, and very important for all countries here, is the prospect of having national plans. So we call it here in a general sense national plans. This could also be termed national action plans or NAPs or national implementation plans. Now this would facilitate compliance later on with the provisions of the plastics treaty. And the discussion here is that would it be based on national circumstances and capabilities? Most members in most countries would say yes. And what would the contents likely be? So there are some countries which would say that the content should be dependent on each country, and they could say what would be inside the NAPs or the national plans, and some would like to have a guidelines and a list of contents in an annex later on. Now for the last part, on the means of implementation specifically, we have an implementation and compliance mechanism. And generally, the countries, most countries would like to have a mechanism to facilitate implementation and compliance towards the provisions of the treaty. And this would likely lead to a committee, what we call an implementation and compliance committee, that would be facilitative, not impose punishments, and would respect national sovereignty and consider national capacities and capabilities. So that's something that may be constituted in line with other environmental agreements to have a compliance committee that would facilitate and promote compliance of member countries later on. So that's a snapshot of what are the issues in focus that are written in the text and will likely be negotiated further in the next negotiation round in Busan in Korea in November. Now, after this snapshot, I'd like to go to some of these specific issues in more detail. Now, in the last INC in Ottawa, we've seen a lot more conversations on financing happening, and this is because there's a lot more interest. There's also the finance coordinating group, which have been organizing events and reaching out to more stakeholders for the financing part of the treaty. I would like to focus on 3 issues that have been discussed in detail in the last negotiations in Ottawa. And the first one is on the issue and the possibilities for innovative finance. So one type of financing that came up a lot is the possibility of scaling up outcomes-based financing and alignment with other tools such as plastic credits and extended producer responsibility. Now, this outcomes-based financing would tie payment to the achievement of outcomes, and this would possibly be the reduction of marine plastic pollution, among other things, and also can provide upfront capital addressing the funding gap, as we've said earlier. Now, this could either be standalone or be connected as well to EPR mechanisms of each respective country. Now, an initiative that has been highlighted was the World Bank project on a plastic waste reduction linked bond, where we have the plastic credits linked as an asset class for payment, as well as the independent certifier for the audit later on, a third-party independent auditing for this mechanism. So this is quite getting more traction in terms of outcomes-based financing, and many other institutions have shown interest in this type of mechanism. The second one, I've said plastic pollution fee. Right now, as it is, it's still in the draft, but there are some issues that have arisen from the discussions on the possibility of a fee. There was a proposal, for instance, to have a small fee based on the polluter pays principle. Some studies have shown that it could be around $60 to $90 per fee on each ton per polymer shared across the supply chain. This would present an outsized environmental benefit with minimal or no social or economic cost or consequences that much. But this has also been a polarizing discussion among member states across the negotiation process. A number of countries would not want to have a fee because they argue that it would present a sovereignty concern. Only countries have the jurisdiction to impose taxes and fees within their own countries, and could also constitute double taxation or levying. While some others also argued that this could be part of EPR processes instead of being a standalone mechanism. So this is something that is still under discussions. We have yet to see what's going to happen in the negotiations in Korea, but this is something that we can look out for in much more detail. And the last one, for some issues, is on the multilateral fund. So this, I've said, could be an option for a dedicated fund or an existing fund that we have, but there are questions that are coming up on the establishment of this fund, on the governance, the modalities on how it is governed, the contributions from countries, how do we get that? And there are also issues in the length of time on setting it up and how to channel resources, for example, from EPR funds coming from the countries. So these are all important questions that are being asked as we go through the negotiations in the multilateral fund. It's been highlighted, for example, in the fund in particular, to look at other examples, such as the Montreal Protocol clearinghouse mechanism as a good example to emulate for this process. Now, as I've given a snapshot of the key financing issues and some of the discussions around that, I'd just like to give a few takeaways from the last INC negotiation round as we go to the next one in Korea, because this is an exciting time as we go through the home stretch of this process. So the first one, the last INCs have been more on streamlining and bracketing on elements where there are no consensus. We have not yet gone to much material negotiations of key issues yet, and we have yet to see what would happen if there are disagreements on key provisions. Would voting be imposed? Would it be more consensus-based? We have yet to see that because the rules of procedure for this specific happening has not yet been discussed. Now, I've said the scope of the instrument is one substantial discussion point that has been again and again brought up. The key issue of debate is what the full life cycle of plastic entails. On one side, there are some countries that define or would like to define the full life cycle of plastics as from upstream measures all the way to downstream measures to waste management. And on another side, there are some groups of countries that would like to define the full life cycle of plastics as only focusing on waste management measures and downstream, the downstream part of the life cycle. And that would be able to focus on ending plastic pollution from the waste management side. So you can see that there are different groups with different opinions on this, and we have yet to see on how this would be resolved in the next negotiation. Now, I'd like to say that most parties are committed to finishing in 2024, but this could also result in the possibility of a compromised ambition. So this might be something that we have to consider as we go to the Busan round, and we have to finish, and the thinking is that we have to finish by this year. Importantly, for this session on finance is that there was a mandate to have intersessional work to inform and provide context for the Busan negotiations to optimize the discussions there later on. But curiously, the intersessional mandate on primary plastic polymers were not adopted. And the exclusion of this key element might forebode the discussions in the Busan round and in negotiations later on. So again, some convergence areas including waste management and just transition are coming up, but there are a lot of other key issues that will be the subject of strong negotiations in the next round. Now, I'd just like to go to the last slide, please, on the outcomes and next steps to know where we are in this whole process. So as I've said, we are at this intersessional period in between INC 4 and INC 5 in Korea. And what will be the discussion points in Korea is that we'll go through the compiled text. It's been shortened a bit from 80 pages. It's now a bit shorter, 58 pages, but it's still a lot of substantial issues that have to be tackled. There will be the establishment of a legal drafting committee in that round in Korea to facilitate the drafting into legalese and treaty language later in the text, so that will be easier in the process. And then, as I've said, there was the mandate to establish 2 intersessional groups. And the first intersessional group that would be of interest is one on the establishment, the options for the financing mechanism. And this includes resource mobilization, alignment of financial flows, and catalyzing finance. And this occasion here where we are together and discuss these options would feed likely into this discussion in the intersessional period in the end of August. Again, there's also another intersessional mandate to discuss options for criteria and other approaches in terms of plastic products and recyclability and reusability in focus, and that will be dealt with in parallel with the financing intersessional work. Now, for the next steps, after this month, in August, there has been a call from UNEP to have the meeting, the intersessional period meeting to discuss these 2 mandates, and that will be in Bangkok, in Thailand, from 24 to 28 August, and that would be very important to provide the context and to provide the information needed for countries and parties to negotiate optimally in the next negotiation in Busan in the Republic of Korea. So I will end there. Again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'd be happy to take any of the questions later on and other issues on the plastics treaty as well. So thank you very much.